In this podcast, I'm going to be discussing and talking through David Zarefsky's article, Strategic Maneuvering and Political Argumentation. First, we're going to talk about the characteristics of political argumentation, the means of strategic maneuvering, and then finally wrap up with some discussion questions. This article also includes a case study, which would make the podcast too long if I included it. So if you want more information on how this stuff comes into play, it's at the very end of this article. Okay, let's get started. So what is political argumentation? Political argumentation is about gaining and using power, about collective decision-making for the public good. It's about mobilizing individuals in the pursuit of a common goal and about giving effective voice to shared hopes and fears. It is the discourse of which public argumentation is the public sphere. So there you can access the principle of unrestricted and for which technical expertise is not the price of admission. Its discourse is often unregulated and also freeform. It reflects not only general understandings of argumentation, but also even more powerfully the particularities of a specific broad culture. It undoubtedly depends upon strategic maneuvering, but it seems the very antithesis of an institutionalized context. Therefore, it's very planned out. So it's not random or it's not very unpredictable. It's situated in particular contexts, so it permits scholars to often reflect on transcending the details of any particular case. It is in this sense that we can speak of political argumentation as institutionalized. The way that Zarefsky talks about political argumentation in his article, he says that it's not an argument between two friends or people talking about politics. It would be a dialogue between people with the right framework to talk about politics. So it would be like presidents or people running for office and things like that. So it's a larger thing than just two people talking. So just it's focusing on the political culture, not two friends talking about it. So now we're talking about some characteristics of political argumentation. Characteristic number 1, there's not really a time limit. Sometimes there are time limits, like think about the recent political debates that are normally 90 minutes, and each candidate has a few minutes to speak on a topic they're talking about. But then if you think about in politics, in the White House, there's certain arguments that don't have a deadline and are always going to be talked about. For example, healthcare. We've been talking about that for 60 years. So something with no time limits, you need your points and your ideas of what you're going to say. They need to be new and refreshing. That's why this is still being talked about, because there's no time frame of when it's not going to end, because it's still in the elections today. Also, since these are very long conversations, arguers must recognize the ongoing nature of a long conversation, yet must not simply repeat the same claims over and over again, so the conversation won't run dry. The second characteristic is that political argumentation has a clear terminus, which means it's often hard to tell when an argument is over. He claims that a way of thinking is not decisively refuted, and at some point people simply find it less useful than a competing perspective as a worldview or explanation of reality. So, for example, the assumption of a monotheistic communism was no longer useful premise for argument after the Soviet Union split in the 60s. So then that conversation kind of dies out and new ones will pop up. But then again, sometimes arguments will end and then come back. This is talked about in the Dred Scott case in the Supreme Court in 1857, talking about slavery. At that time it was really popular, but now it's not, so we don't talk about it. But the Roe versus Wade case in the 70s about abortion is something we still talk about today. So then the third characteristic, the audience is heterogeneous. If this wasn't so, there'd be little to argue about. So in his example, in his reading, he talks about the United States. There's to generalize, which you really shouldn't do, to generalize an audience, which you need to do because there's so many different views. So as regarding social knowledge in the United States, 3 aspects would be the market mechanism generally works, we want what's best for our children, and a higher power guides our destiny. So those are the norms in the United States. So when you're trying to get your arguments towards that specific group, you try to market that point, so then you have more people on your side. So then the fourth characteristic, political argumentation is open to all, which then creates restraints. This means it's open for people who are less educated, more educated, so it's sometimes difficult because people are at different levels of how they think about a situation. He says that less sophisticated arguers cannot be expected to use technical terms accurately or say exactly what they mean. More sophisticated arguers may find that their understanding of a standpoint is not shared by other participants or spectators. So then to really understand that. So that's why town hall meetings are really important because they're more for citizens to understand arguments more than journalists and politicians who can go to press conferences and things like that. So now we're going to summarize the characteristics. There are some of the institutional conventions that shape political argumentation, which are no limits, no way to be sure that an argument is over, heterogeneous audiences holding inconsistent standpoints, naive theories of attribution and motivation, and coerce of assumption that access to argumentation is open to all, and which makes it necessary often for argument to be reconstructed. So now we're going to talk about the means of strategic maneuvering, which is possible due to the characteristics of political argumentation. So the means of strategic maneuvering suggest three broad categories, including topical potential, the selection of what lines of argument can use, audience demand, and the adaptation of one's argument to the beliefs and commitments of the audience, and representational choice, referring to the matters of style, structure, clarity, literalness, or figurativeness, and so on. So the first one is changing the subject. An example of this would be President Bush trying to focus on the health of the economy in his run for office, whereas President Clinton sought to do the same instead of people keep talking about his affair. The second one would be modifying the relevant audience. So the second is to change the scope of the relevant audience. So you're trying to get the best chance to win the argument. So shaping that argument in whatever way possible. So, for example, in 1962, President Kennedy gave a speech at Yale talking about the economy policy that no longer raised broad questions of right and wrong, but involved the practical management of a complex economy. He was trying to remove the issue from the realm of political argument and reassign it to the technosphere where only experts need to worry about. So the citizens didn't need to worry about it, but he would take care of it, and that would happen for him. And then the third, which would be appealing to liberal and conservative presumptions. If this is to construct arguments that appeal to both the liberal and conservative presumptions, so you're trying to get all people on your side, which is somewhat hard to do, especially in like elections today, but you're trying to frame your argument to work for both parties. So that leads into reframing the argument. So that's how to frame a given argument. So what issue you're talking about, you're going to frame it in a way that works for many people. For example, say like there was a loss of jobs in other nations, that can be framed as a threat to domestic economy, that we need to help our economy, people need to get more jobs. The fifth is using condensed symbols. To accommodate for the diversity of their audiences, political arguers often employ condensation symbols, visual or verbal symbols that condense a range of different meanings into generally positive or negative connotations. An example of this would be the national flag as a symbol of unity and togetherness. The sixth one would be employing the lotus of irreparable. Another characteristic of diverse audience is that some members will be ready to take action, others may be opposed, and still a large may be uncommitted. So what you want to do is bring those dormant beliefs and values to the surface so that people act when they listen. So the final means of strategic maneuvering is using figures and tropes argumentatively. This is just like how you're speaking. There's many devices in speaking. Examples would be repetition to create momentum, alliteration to create memorable phrases, antithesis to suggest open-mindedness and the ability to see both sides, the locus of imperable to create a sense of urgency, and so on. President Bush did this when he, in his fight against Iraq, by saying Saddam Hussein was a lot like Adolf Hitler and that we need to take action, and Iraq can't be another Vietnam, so hoping that would invoke the sense of frustration with a quagmire that characteristics of the early war so that people will take action. So now I have some discussion questions. I'm on the discussion, so you can talk about them one or